On the first day of January 1959, Fulgencio Batista, one of the most powerful men in Cuba, boarded a plane and left his country forever. Behind him lay decades of political influence, military command, and presidential authority. Ahead lay exile, obscurity, and eventually death in a foreign land. But Batista did not leave alone. He took with him a family, including multiple children, each of whom would face a singular question. What happens when the foundation of power disappears overnight? This video is not about Fulgencio Batista. It is not a political examination of his rule, his decisions, or his legacy in Cuban history. This is a biographical investigation into what became of his children. Where did they go? How did they live? What paths did they take after the collapse of the world they knew? We will examine each child individually, moving chronologically through their lives from birth to adulthood, through exile, careers, marriages, and deaths. We will separate verifiable facts from rumor and document how inheritance, silence, and displacement shaped 9 separate lives in 9 different ways. The goal of this video is straightforward: to document what became of Batista's children. We will separate historical myth from verifiable life paths. We will show how exile, silence, and inheritance shaped each life differently. There will be no sensationalism, no political defense or condemnation. This is a factual, biographical account, chapter by chapter, child by child, from beginning to end. Mirta Batista was born in 1927 in Cuba, the first child of Fulgencio Batista and his first wife, Elisa Batista. At the time of her birth, Batista was not yet the powerful figure he would become. He was a rising military officer, a sergeant stenographer with ambitions that extended far beyond his rank. Mirta entered a household where power was still being constructed, where her father's influence was growing but not yet consolidated. Mirta's childhood coincided with one of the most turbulent periods in Cuban political history. In 1933, when she was 6 years old, her father participated in the Sergeants' Revolt, which overthrew the government of Gerardo Machado. Suddenly, Batista was no longer a low-ranking officer. He became the chief of the armed forces, the real power behind a series of puppet presidents. Mirta's childhood home transformed from a modest military residence to the center of Cuban political life. As Mirta moved through adolescence in the late 1930s and early 1940s, her father's position fluctuated. Batista served as Cuba's president from 1940 to 1944, then stepped down. This period of relative normality, where Batista was powerful but not omnipotent, shaped Mirta's understanding of political life. She witnessed both the exercise of power and the voluntary relinquishment of it, a pattern her father would later abandon. Mirta received the education typical of elite Cuban families during this era. She attended private schools, learned multiple languages, and was prepared for a life within Cuba's upper social circles. By her early 20s, she had witnessed her father's return to power through a military coup in 1952, which installed him as president once again. This second presidency was different, more authoritarian, more contested, and ultimately more fragile. During the 1950s, as Batista's grip on Cuba tightened and opposition mounted, Mirta lived within the protective sphere of the presidential family. She attended state functions, moved through Havana's social elite, and occupied a position of privilege that seemed permanent. The growing insurgency in the mountains, led by Fidel Castro and others, appeared distant from the marble halls and secured compounds where the Batista family lived. When Batista fled Cuba on January 1, 1959, Mirta left with him. The transition was immediate and total. One day she lived in Cuba as the daughter of the president. The next day she was a refugee. The family initially relocated to the Dominican Republic, then to Portugal, and eventually to Spain. For Mirta, who was 31 years old at the time of exile, this represented the complete destruction of the world she had known for 3 decades. Eventually, Mirta settled in the United States, where a significant Cuban exile community was forming. Unlike some of her siblings, she maintained a low public profile. She did not give interviews, write memoirs, or engage with historians. Her life in the United States was defined by privacy and distance from the political legacy her father left behind. Mirta married and raised a family in the United States. Details of her marriage and children remain largely private, consistent with her overall approach to life after exile. She chose to build a life separate from her father's historical shadow, focusing on family rather than legacy. Mirta maintained contact with Batista until his death in 1973. The nature of their relationship in exile is not extensively documented, but she was present during his final years in Spain. Whether she experienced resentment, loyalty, or ambivalence toward the man whose political choices forced her into permanent exile remains unknown. She left no public record of her feelings. Mirta Batista lived for more than 5 decades after leaving Cuba. She died in 2010 at the age of 83, having spent the majority of her life in exile. Her death received minimal media attention, consistent with the quiet existence she had maintained since 1959. Mirta's legacy is one of deliberate obscurity. She left behind no writings, no interviews, and no public statements about her father or her life. In choosing silence, she represented one approach to the question of inheritance, complete withdrawal from historical engagement. Her life after 1959 was entirely civilian, entirely private, and entirely removed from the political world that defined her first 3 decades. Elisa Batista was born in 1933, 6 years after her sister Mirta. By this time, Batista had already executed the Sergeant's Revolt and established himself as the dominant force in Cuban politics. Elisa's birth occurred during a period of relative stability in her father's career after the chaos of the coup, but before his first presidency. Elisa's childhood was spent entirely within the sphere of political power. Unlike Mirta, who remembered a time before influence, Elisa's earliest memories were of privilege, security, and status. She grew up in a household where her father's authority was unquestioned, where military officers deferred and politicians courted favor. As Batista's daughter, Elisa appeared at state functions and public events. Photographs from the 1940s and 1950s show her at her father's side during official ceremonies. This visibility, while not extreme by modern standards, marked her as a public figure in Cuban society. She was recognizable, known, and associated with the regime. In 1959, at the age of 26, Elisa left Cuba with her family. The exile was particularly disorienting for her generation. Old enough to have fully internalized their social position, but young enough to face decades of life without it. She relocated to the United States, where she would spend the rest of her life. Elisa married and had children in the United States. Her son, Robert F. Darrow, would eventually become a prominent figure in American legal circles, representing a form of success entirely separate from his grandfather's political legacy. Through her son, Elisa's life connected to American professional achievement rather than Cuban political history. In the United States, Elisa lived quietly. She did not seek publicity, did not engage with media, and did not participate in the ongoing debates about her father's legacy. Her life was domestic and private, focused on family rather than history. Robert F. Darrow became a successful attorney and later a judge in Florida. His career represented a complete break from his grandfather's path, achieved through education, legal merit, and American institutional channels rather than military force or political maneuvering. Elisa's legacy became tied to this next generation's success. Elisa maintained contact with her father during his exile. She visited him in Spain and was part of the family circle that surrounded him until his death in 1973. The emotional texture of their relationship in exile is not documented, but her continued presence suggests some degree of familial loyalty or obligation. Elisa's legacy is primarily genealogical. She represents the link between Batista's Cuba and a thoroughly Americanized next generation. Her son's achievements in American law created a narrative of immigrant success, though one complicated by the specific circumstances of that immigration. Fulgencio Batista, known as Papo, was born in 1933, the first son of Fulgencio Batista and Elisa Godinez. His birth gave him a position of particular significance within the family structure. In traditional Cuban culture, the eldest son carried expectations of continuation, of carrying forward the family name and, potentially, its influence. Papo grew up in immediate proximity to power. He witnessed his father's political maneuvers, attended state functions, and was groomed, whether explicitly or implicitly, to understand the mechanics of authority. His childhood was spent in presidential residences, surrounded by guards, advisors, and the apparatus of state control. Papo received the finest education available in Cuba during the 1940s and 1950s. He attended elite schools, was tutored in multiple subjects, and was prepared for a life of influence. The assumption, unstated but pervasive, was that his path would involve either politics, military service, or business leadership within Cuba's power structure. During his father's second presidency in the 1950s, Papo was in his 20s. He moved through Havana's most exclusive circles, had access to resources unavailable to ordinary Cubans, and occupied a position at the apex of Cuban society. This period represented the height of his social power. The revolution ended this trajectory immediately. At 26, Papo left Cuba, never to return. The psychological impact of this displacement, the sudden loss of status, country, and assumed future, shaped the rest of his life. He went from the son of Cuba's president to a refugee in a matter of hours. Papo eventually settled in Florida, where he lived for nearly 5 decades. Unlike some siblings who maintained strict privacy, he occasionally made public statements about his father and the Cuban exile experience. He defended his father's legacy in interviews, though these were infrequent and often met with controversy. Papo married and raised children in the United States. His family life was private, and his children grew up as Americans, far removed from the political conflicts that defined their grandfather's life. They represented a generation for whom Cuba was history rather than memory. In the decades after exile, Papo occasionally spoke to media outlets about his father. He pushed back against characterizations he viewed as unfair or historically inaccurate. These interventions were measured but noticeable, marking him as one of the few Batista children willing to engage publicly with their father's contested legacy. Papo maintained close contact with his father throughout exile. He visited him regularly in Spain and was present during Batista's final illness. The bond between them appears to have remained strong despite, or perhaps because of, the shared experience of displacement and loss. Fulgencio Ruben Papo Batista died in 2007 at the age of 74. His death marked the passing of one of the last Batista children who remembered Cuba as adults, who had experienced the full arc from power to exile. His occasional public statements left a small but distinct historical footprint, a voice defending a legacy most others preferred to forget. Firmina Batista Estevez was born in 1935, the daughter of Fulgencio Batista and Luz Estevez. She was born outside of Batista's marriage to Elisa Godinez, a fact that defined her position within the family structure from the beginning. In 1930s Cuba, children born outside marriage occupied a distinct and often difficult social position. Batista acknowledged Firmina as his daughter and provided financial support throughout her childhood. This acknowledgement was significant. It meant she carried the Batista name and had access to resources. However, it did not grant her the same status as the children of his marriages. Firmina's childhood was separate from the public Batista family. She did not live in presidential residences, did not appear at state functions, and did not occupy the visible position held by her half-siblings. Her childhood was marked by this distance, this separation from the center of power. Despite acknowledgement and financial support, Firmina faced social limitations. Cuban society in the 1940s and 1950s drew sharp distinctions between legitimate and illegitimate children. This social reality shaped her opportunities, her relationships, and her place within the extended Batista family structure. Firmina lived a civilian life, far removed from politics and public attention. Details of her adult years are limited, consistent with her peripheral position in the family narrative. She did not leave Cuba during the initial exile, remaining instead in the country after the revolution. Firmina married and raised a family in Cuba. Her life continued in her homeland, separated from the exile community that formed around her father and half-siblings. This geographic separation created a complete divergence in life experience from her siblings who fled. The nature of Firmina's relationship with her father after 1959 is unclear. Communication between Cuba and exile was difficult, monitored, and often impossible. Whether they maintained contact, whether he provided continued support from abroad, whether she wished to leave or chose to stay, these questions remain unanswered. Firmina occupies a marginal position in the Batista family narrative. She is mentioned in genealogies, acknowledged in family histories, but rarely examined in detail. Her life represents the experience of acknowledged but not fully included children, a reality that transcends the specific circumstances of the Batista family. Jorge Luis Batista was born in 1942, the son of Fulgencio Batista and Marta Fernandez. He was born before his parents' marriage, which took place in 1945 after Batista's divorce from Elisa Godinez. This timing placed Jorge in a transitional moment in his father's personal life. After his parents married, Jorge grew up in the presidential environment of the 1950s. His childhood was spent in the Palacio Presidencial and other official residences. He attended elite schools, had access to resources unavailable to most Cubans, and was raised within the protective sphere of state power. Jorge received an education befitting his position. He studied at the best schools Cuba offered, was tutored by qualified instructors, and was prepared for a future that assumed continued privilege and opportunity within Cuba. This education was comprehensive but ultimately rendered obsolete by exile. The revolution occurred when Jorge was 16 years old. This age, old enough to understand what was happening, young enough to have years ahead without the country he knew, created particular psychological challenges. His adolescence ended abruptly, replaced by displacement and uncertainty. Jorge left Cuba as a teenager and faced the task of completing his education and entering adulthood in a foreign country. The challenge of maintaining identity while adapting to new circumstances defined his late teenage years and early 20s. As an adult, Jorge lived quietly in the United States. He pursued a civilian career, maintained privacy, and avoided public attention. His adult life was characterized by deliberate distance from his father's political legacy and the ongoing debates about Cuban history. Jorge married and raised children. His family life was private and suburban, typical of middle-class American existence. His children grew up as Americans, with Cuba as abstract history rather than lived memory. Unlike most of his siblings, Jorge occasionally cooperated with historians and researchers studying his father's era. These interactions were limited and controlled, but they provided some documentary value for understanding the Batista family's internal dynamics and post-exile experience. Jorge maintained contact with his father during exile. He visited Batista in Spain and was part of the family network that remained connected across continents. The quality of their relationship in exile appears to have been functional, though details remain private. Jorge Luis Batista died around 2021 or 2022. His death received no significant media coverage, consistent with the private life he had maintained since adolescence. His legacy is primarily genealogical, a link in the chain connecting Batista to later generations. Roberto Batista Fernandez, known as Bobby, was born in 1947, during his father's period between presidencies. By this time, Batista had already served one presidential term and was positioning for his eventual return to power through the 1952 coup. Bobby's birth occurred during a moment of wealth and influence, even if not formal office. Bobby's childhood coincided exactly with his father's second, more authoritarian presidency. From ages 5 to 11, he lived inside the apparatus of state power. His formative years were spent in presidential residences, surrounded by guards, servants, and the constant presence of political authority. When the revolution came, Bobby was 11 years old. This age proved crucial, old enough to have strong memories of Cuba, young enough to be shaped entirely by what came after. His education, his worldview, and his identity were all formed in exile, creating a particular psychological position between two worlds. Bobby completed his education in the United States and Spain. He studied law and eventually became an attorney, practicing primarily in Spain. This career choice represented a path of institutional legitimacy, success achieved through formal education and professional qualification rather than political connection or inherited position. Bobby split his adult life between Spain and the United States. In Spain, he practiced law and raised a family. In the United States, he maintained connections with the Cuban exile community. This dual existence allowed him to navigate both European and American contexts while remaining connected to his Cuban heritage. Unlike many of his siblings, Bobby chose deliberate public engagement with his father's legacy. He gave interviews, spoke at events, and actively participated in historical discussions about the Batista era. This engagement was measured and controlled, but it was nonetheless real. Bobby's most significant contribution to the historical record was his book, Hijo de Batista, Son of Batista, published later in his life. The book provided a personal perspective on growing up as Batista's son, the experience of exile, and the challenge of inheriting a contested legacy. It remains one of the few direct testimonies from Batista's children. Bobby married and raised children in Spain. His family life was stable and middle class, achieved through professional work rather than political position. His children grew up Spanish, with Cuba as ancestral history rather than homeland. Bobby maintained a close relationship with his father throughout exile. He visited him regularly in Spain and was present during Batista's final years. In his writing and interviews, Bobby defended his father's memory while acknowledging the complexity of his legacy. Roberto Bobby Batista Fernandez died in 2022 at the age of 75. His death marked the passing of the most publicly engaged of Batista's children. Through his book and interviews, he left behind the most substantial first-person account of life as Batista's child, making him the primary voice for that experience in the historical record. Carlos Manuel Batista Fernandez was born in 1950 during his father's final presidency. His birth occurred as opposition to Batista's regime was growing, as the economic and political tensions that would eventually fuel revolution were intensifying. Carlos was only 8 years old when the family fled Cuba. Unlike his older siblings, he had limited memories of life in Cuba. His childhood was predominantly shaped by exile, by movement between countries, by the experience of being displaced. At some point during his childhood or early adolescence, Carlos was diagnosed with a serious illness. The specific nature of this illness and the circumstances of his medical treatment remain private family information, not extensively documented in public sources. Carlos Manuel Batista Fernandez died in 1969 at the age of 19. His death occurred in exile, far from the country where he was born. He never returned to Cuba, never experienced adulthood, and never had the opportunity to define his own relationship to his father's legacy. Carlos's early death had a profound impact on the Batista family. For Fulgencio Batista, it meant losing a son before his own death in 1973. For Carlos's mother, Marta Fernandez, it meant losing a child at a young age. For his siblings, it meant the permanent absence of a family member who never had the chance to tell his own story. Fulgencio José Batista Fernandez was born in 1953, named after his father. His birth occurred during a period of increasing instability in Cuba as armed opposition to Batista's rule was beginning to organize. Fulgencio José spent his early childhood in Cuba but was too young to have meaningful memories of it. He was only 5 years old when the family went into exile, making him part of the generation that grew up entirely outside Cuba. Fulgencio José was raised in exile primarily in Spain and the United States. His upbringing was marked by movement, adaptation, and the task of forming identity without a homeland. He attended schools in multiple countries, learned multiple languages, and navigated multiple cultural contexts. Fulgencio José received a complete education abroad. Details of his educational path and professional career are limited, consistent with his choice to maintain privacy. He did not seek public attention and did not engage with media or historians about his father. Fulgencio José married and raised children. His family life was private and removed from public scrutiny. His children represent another generation further removed from Cuba, for whom Batista is a distant historical figure rather than a grandfather they knew. As one of the younger children, Fulgencio José had a shorter period with his father before Batista's death in 1973. He was only 20 when his father died, meaning his adult relationship with Batista was brief. The impact of his father's legacy on his own identity remains undocumented. Unlike his brother Bobby, who chose public engagement, Fulgencio José chose anonymity. He did not write memoirs, did not give interviews, and did not participate in public discussions about his father. This choice represents another response to the question of inherited legacy. Complete withdrawal from historical debate. Marta Maria Batista Fernandez was born in 1957, making her the youngest of Batista's acknowledged children. Her birth occurred just 2 years before the revolution, during the final period of her father's rule when opposition had become armed insurgency. Marta was only 2 years old when the family fled Cuba. She has no personal memories of the country, no direct experience of the life her older siblings knew. Her entire conscious life has been lived in exile. Marta's childhood and adolescence took place entirely outside Cuba. She was raised in Spain and the United States, educated in foreign schools, and formed her identity without any connection to the country of her birth. Cuba exists for her only as family history and abstract heritage. Marta received her education abroad and entered adulthood as a fully assimilated member of Spanish or American society, depending on where she settled. Her life has been shaped by the second-generation exile experience, connected to Cuban heritage through family, but without personal memory of the homeland. Marta married and raised children. Details of her family life are private, consistent with the pattern established by most of Batista's children. Her children represent a third generation removed from Cuba, for whom Batista is distant history. Marta's relationship with her father was abbreviated by his death when she was only 16 years old. She had limited time as a conscious individual with Batista, and her memories of him are those of a child rather than an adult. This curtailed relationship shapes her position in the family narrative. Marta represents the children who have no memory of Cuba, who grew up entirely in exile, and for whom their father's legacy is something learned rather than experienced. Her life illustrates how quickly direct connection to historical events dissolves across generations. 9 children. 9 different responses to the same fundamental question, how do you live after power collapses? Some, like Mirta and Fulgencio Jose, chose silence and privacy. Others, like Bobby, engaged publicly with their father's legacy through writing and interviews. Some, like Papo, occasionally defended their father in public statements. Some, like Firmina, remained in Cuba entirely. One, Carlos, died too young to make any choice at all. None of Batista's children pursued political careers. None attempted to return to Cuba after the revolution. None tried to rebuild their father's influence or reclaim his legacy through political action. The dynasty ended absolutely in 1959. What followed was dispersion, adaptation, and the pursuit of civilian lives in countries far from their birth. The overwhelming pattern across these 9 lives is privacy. Most of Batista's children gave no interviews, wrote no memoirs, and made no public statements about their father or their experience of exile. This silence may represent trauma, strategic withdrawal, simple preference for private life, or some combination of all 3. Whatever its source, it means the historical record of their lives is thin, fragmentary, and incomplete. What Batista's children inherited was not power, not wealth, not political influence. What they inherited was exile. They inherited displacement, the loss of homeland, the challenge of building lives in foreign countries without the status they had known. This inheritance shaped every subsequent choice, every career path, every decision about whether to speak or remain silent. Within this overall pattern of privacy, there are degrees. Bobby chose measured public engagement. Papo made occasional statements. Jorge cooperated with some historians. But even these acts of visibility were limited, controlled, and far from the full-throated defense or comprehensive memoir one might expect from children of a contested leader. The default position was anonymity, with only occasional exceptions. One might ask, do these lives represent tragedy, success, quiet dignity, cowardice? The answer depends entirely on one's perspective on their father. For those who view Batista as a dictator, his children's withdrawal from public life and political ambition may seem appropriate or even insufficient. For those who view him differently, their silence may seem like abandonment of his memory. But such judgments impose external frameworks onto private lives. What is verifiable is simply what happened. 9 people, scattered across continents, built civilian lives far from Cuba. As generations pass, direct connection to historical events dissolves. Batista's grandchildren grew up American, Spanish, or, in other contexts, entirely foreign to 1950s Cuba. His great-grandchildren have even less connection. Within a few generations, Batista becomes a name in a family tree, a historical figure studied in books, but not a living memory. This dissolution is not unique to the Batista family. It is the normal process by which history becomes history rather than lived experience. Fulgencio Batista's rule ended abruptly on January 1, 1959. His children's lives unfolded quietly across the decades that followed. They married, raised families, pursued careers, and died, most in obscurity, all in exile. Their legacy is not political. It is not dramatic. It is simply the legacy of adaptation, of building new lives after the old world disappeared, of choosing silence over engagement with a past too complicated to explain and too painful to defend. In this, they represent not just the children of Batista, but the children of exile itself, a condition defined by loss, distance, and the slow, quiet work of beginning again.